Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Subscribe here on the channel, wherever you download your podcasts, and of course over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. Now, we are all aware at this point of what happened in the earliest hours of the new year in New Orleans. 15 people, including the suspected terrorist attacker, are dead. 35 others are injured. People were partying on Bourbon Street when the suspect drove around obviously inadequate barricades, rammed them with a car. The FBI, and this is what I want to talk about here, immediately botched its response in two very, very important ways. So first, FBI Special Agent Alethea Duncan said at an early morning press conference, this is a quote, "This is not a terrorist event," unquote. The Bureau itself, shortly after Duncan said that, said it was being investigated as, quote, an act of terrorism. These are mutually exclusive statements that came in rapid succession. If you are investigating terrorism, you do not definitively rule it out, especially since the suspect was driving a truck with an ISIS flag. The FBI was almost certainly aware of the ISIS flag in the truck at that point. So it's a huge error. At best, it's an error. Now, worse, later in the day, after confirming the terrorism investigation, the FBI said that it did not believe the suspect acted alone. This happened, of course, as a Cybertruck exploded outside of Donald Trump's hotel in Las Vegas. So the public then was led to believe, whether or not those two events were connected, and we'll get to that in just a moment, that ISIS-sympathizing terrorists were on the loose in the country. Now, the Sugar Bowl game was canceled as it was in New Orleans. Officials were afraid they could not secure the event. The Associated Press reported in the afternoon that, quote, investigators have reviewed video of 3 men and a woman placing explosives in connection with the deadly car attack in New Orleans' French Quarter. By the next day, the FBI was saying, actually, the suspect acted alone, according to information at that point in the investigation. So this is a significant pivot in a very short period of time to go from we don't think he acted alone to telling the press that they looked at suspects potentially planting IEDs, meaning they would be on the loose with a guy who acting in concert with a guy who had an ISIS flag and was promoting his own support for ISIS. To go from one to the other within a day is significant. That is a significant change, and this is why that narrative shift was described by local reporter Andrew Gallo rightfully as a, quote, massive pivot from the FBI. To make that massive pivot, after the first massive pivot from this is not a terrorist event to we are investigating this as an act of terror, to have both of those shifts in the same period of about 12 hours is an incredible indictment of the FBI. That is a level of staggering incompetence. Now, the FBI, including Duncan, by the way, who we mentioned earlier, also took part in a disgraceful midday press conference on New Year's Day with state and local officials. It descended into chaos. It was reflective of an attitude of just defensiveness and arrogance. They made a mistake. Clearly, New Orleans was not secure. Clearly, they said something incorrect earlier in the day. And then they continued to say something incorrect after that press conference. But they almost shut the press conference down shortly after letting reporters start asking questions because they didn't like the questions reporters were asking. They said they weren't going to be able to answer them, so they were just going to take the whole press conference down. The entire attitude was very defensive, saying, we did our best. We had all of this protection in place, but the suspected terrorists evaded our best efforts. It was an incredible display of arrogance and almost entitlement from officials that includes Republican Senator John Kennedy, who made a weird joke about the press at the press conference. He also seemed to box the FBI spokesperson out, which could be reflective of deep and reasonable frustrations with the Bureau that was spreading what we now know to be disinformation at the time. even though it appears to be disinformation that they actually believed at that point in time. They're now saying, as of Thursday, that the people they believed were potentially acting with the suspected terrorist were just looking at coolers that had been placed around the French Quarter. So, I mean, just significant shifts in the narrative. Terrible public relations, which is actually an important part of the investigation and of the FBI's job. Obviously, that's secondary to their ability to keep people safe and to bring people to justice. But it is worth noting in this conversation about a pattern of grave mistakes that they made. This was an awful response. The state's governor, Jeff Landry, posted a picture of himself at a steakhouse on the evening of New Year's Day, less than 24 hours after the attack. And in his argument was that it was important to project an image of strength for New Orleans, to say that business is open, we won't be deterred by terrorism, all of which is true and can be conveyed without the governor smiling in front of the prime rib while people were still mourning their loved ones whose bodies had been peeled off of Bourbon Street hours before. Just an awful response, awful from everyone, not merely the understandable snags of a complicated and fast-moving investigation. Those are always understandable. This was a pattern of failure. Local law enforcement did not secure the event. The FBI did not accurately describe its own investigation, and the FBI then projected significant wrong information. And we still don't know right now the extent of the FBI's failure to identify the suspect in advance. And that will also likely constitute a significant failure, given that the suspect appears to have posted about his support for ISIS shortly before the attack, which raises questions about how much he had posted anywhere before the attack or said things before the attack that would invite necessary scrutiny from law enforcement. So just across the board, from what we know right now, significant repeated failures from the FBI in the early hours of the attack, not just the FBI, but also state and local officials. This is already reflective of failing institutions, from the FBI to the governor's office, which allowed that photo to be posted and then defended the photo being posted. But particularly in this case, local law enforcement, a failed institution, did not keep people safe, was arrogant about its inability to keep people safe, was defensive about its inability to keep people safe. And then the FBI, which came in and made, at least at this point, 2 significant errors within the day of this all happening. So let's turn to the suspect. ABC News reports 42-year-old Shamsuddin Jabbar is, quote, an Army veteran and U.S.-born citizen who lived in Houston. U.S.-born citizen. So if the suspect turns out to have accomplices, that's different, obviously, and that would raise questions about people who potentially, if these accomplices ended up coming across the border during the Biden administration or before, failure to vet people coming into the country. And we know that happens dozens of times every single year. People from the terrorist watch list are identified to have crossed the border basically every year in recent years in large numbers. We know that happens. There are many people who, people who are veterans of law enforcement and the military, who say that it's surely happening and is going to potentially manifest itself in very dangerous ways as time goes on. So Donald Trump has said some things to that extent in the aftermath of what happened in New Orleans. But in this case, it appears this was a U.S. citizen, lived in Houston, was a Christian until converting to Islam a long time ago. This is more from ABC News, who says Jabbar had a checkered marital history punctuated by multiple divorces and financial difficulty, according to court records reviewed by ABC News. In a YouTube video posted in 2020, he said he was born and raised in Beaumont, Texas, and spent a decade working in the U.S. military before becoming a realtor in the Houston area. His years in the military were spent working as a human resources and IT specialist, he said in the video, which has since been removed from YouTube. Jabbar worked for Deloitte, a major government contractor, by the way, serving in a staff-level role since 2021. A spokesperson for the firm confirmed to ABC News. Here's more from the New York Times, which reported a senior law enforcement official said that Mr. Jabbar had posted several videos to his Facebook account Tuesday evening, apparently addressed to his family and recorded while he was driving, in which he, quote, pledged allegiance to ISIS. Dwayne Marsh, who is married to Mr. Jabbar's ex-wife, said Mr. Jabbar had been acting erratically in recent months, quote, being all crazy, cutting his hair, after converting to Islam. Mr. Marsh said he and his wife stopped allowing the two daughters she shared with Mr. Jabbar, ages 15 and 20, to spend time with him. As of now, it's a little confusing about when Jabbar actually converted to Islam, when these reported erratic, potentially mental health issues started to surface. We don't know that timeline clearly right now, so we can't say exactly how badly the FBI failed to identify a potential terrorist threat on our own soil. What we do know is that he says he was inspired by ISIS sometime in the summer. We know that he was involved at this point in posting videos shortly before, as this report just said, before the attack. So that leaves some window of time, presumably. We don't know how big that window of time is before he posts to his Facebook, pledging his allegiance to ISIS while he was driving. Was that while he was driving up to Bourbon Street? Is that while he's driving still in Texas, going from the Houston area to New Orleans? We don't know. We don't have the answers to that. Obviously, those are important questions because it will reflect how much should have been known and all of that. And it's still possible that there are accomplices. Now, the FBI has gone through devices that they've recovered from the suspect at this point, and they don't believe that there were accomplices. You would think that if there were accomplices, they would have a good idea of that after going through the devices and scanning all the CCTV footage, which originally led them to believe other people had helped plant these IEDs on Bourbon Street. But there are more questions to be answered about the failure of our institutions to keep Americans safe. That is the bottom line. There's always going to be crime. There's no question about it. But in this case, the barricades were clearly inadequate, and we have somebody who had been acting erratically and ended up going through those barricades and killing 14 innocent people. So a lot of that is still on the table. What's also on the table is similarities. The FBI has now said they do not believe that what happened in Las Vegas and what happened in New Orleans are related, but the similarities do continue to raise serious questions. And there may be a perfectly explainable reason for why these two things happened so quickly in succession. So, for example, the one point a lot of people have made about the Cybertruck explosion, which happened midday on New Year's Day. So the country was reeling from what happened in New Orleans. Then a Cybertruck exploded right outside of the Trump property in Las Vegas, right basically in front of what appears to have been the lobby, the front entrance, or a major entrance to that building. And it's looking like this was also a terrorist act. It didn't have the death toll that happened in New Orleans. What we've seen so far is just the person, the suspect in this case, was killed. But people have pointed out that both cars, so the car that was used in New Orleans and the car that was used in Las Vegas, were rented on the service called Turo. Now, that's interesting because it's not the most popular rental service. I also want to point out they both used vehicles. That sounds like a silly thing because it's so obvious, but both suspects used vehicles to perpetrate their actions. That is significant. Both used trucks. It's not just that they both decided to use vehicles. It's that both of those vehicles were trucks. Also significant. Electric vehicles. Also significant. All of these are really unusual for when we see this type of thing happen. Obviously, it's unusual. It's not rare exactly that people have electric vehicles in the United States, but it's still not popular enough to be common. It's still somewhat unusual to see that happen. So those similarities are all worth paying attention to. And both suspects, by the way, are Army veterans. very, very significant that they are both Army veterans and both obviously were perpetrating their actions on New Year's. So again, some of that stuff sounds really obvious, but it's worth saying. It sounds obvious that they both decided to use vehicles and they both decided to do it on New Year's Day. One thing that's possible is what happened in Las Vegas was in some strange way related or as a reaction to what happened in New Orleans. We have absolutely no idea as of right now, but that's also a possibility. Someone saw what happened in New Orleans and reacted to it in this way. But to say there are no connections is interesting from law enforcement. That may turn out to be entirely true. These similarities, at least superficially, are compelling. That you have the same app, same like to use an electric vehicle, to use a truck, to come from Army veterans that had experience at Fort Bragg. I believe both of them had experiences at Fort Bragg. I don't know that we know if they overlapped. Yes, here I'm looking at this from the New York Post right now. They both served at Fort Bragg, which is an Army base in North Carolina. Jabbar was there it looks like it was in 2012. It's not called Fort Liberty, of course. So this is already that's already a very specific and narrow similarity. I would say it looks like he was there in 2013. The Las Vegas suspect was a Green Beret and lived in North Carolina at the same time as Jabbar. This is according to the New York Post, although he was in Charlotte, which is about 2.5 hours away from Fort Liberty. So it's also a really big base, but it's a similarity in addition to the other similarities that raises questions that law enforcement will have to answer, obviously, if these are truly not connected in any way. It's a pretty strange thing to have happened so closely. It is, of course, again, possible that someone saw this attack in an electric truck, which is a vehicle, all of these sort of very specific things happen and responded in this way. But we don't know that right now. We do know that law enforcement is essentially ruling out any connections between the two actions. So many questions that need to be answered, but I think one important takeaway as we are, about 2 days into trying to piece together what the governor, Jeff Landry, has described as like a jigsaw puzzle of what happened in New Orleans specifically. One huge takeaway that already we can be confident in is that our institutions failed, and that the FBI in particular absolutely botched its response to what happened in New Orleans. And obviously, just if we step back and take the political angle, obviously secondary to the human angle, this is significant because Republicans are trying to confirm a dramatic, revolutionary new appointment as FBI director, or nominee as FBI director in Kash Patel. We've covered Kash Patel on this program recently, but he's somebody who wants to basically upend the way the FBI functions and says that it is structurally at this point, it's structurally flawed at this point. So you can expect this to come up a lot at Kash Patel's confirmation hearing, which will happen after Donald Trump, who has nominated him to the post, is inaugurated on January 20th. You can expect Republicans to ask what would be done differently at the FBI. You can expect Democrats then to be dissatisfied, perhaps, or scared by Kash Patel's dissatisfied with or scared by Kash Patel's suggestions for radical change. But it'll certainly make the idea that the FBI needs radical change easier to sell to the public, having so much whiplash, having experienced so much whiplash so quickly in the response here from New Orleans. So we will continue to pay very close attention to the story here at Undercurrents. We appreciate all your support. Make sure to subscribe here on the channel. Subscribe wherever you download your podcasts, and the premium edition of the show you can subscribe to over at undercurrents.tv. Stay tuned because there's a lot more to come on this story and with many, many stories in the new year as the new administration takes shape here in Washington, D.C. We'll be back with more soon.